In the waning months of 1889, deep in the rolling hills of Bavaria, a quiet and almost imperceptible experiment was taking place, one that would slip through the cracks of history almost as soon as it began. Bavaria, a land known for its romantic landscapes and medieval castles, was at the time an unlikely backdrop for a story of obsession, secrecy, and ambition bordering on the unnatural. The world outside was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities, while new scientific ideas were spreading across Europe with an almost feverish intensity. Darwin's theories had begun to challenge long-held beliefs, and genetics, although in its infancy, was already stirring the imagination of the boldest and most curious minds. Within this atmosphere, a group of scientists and aristocrats turned their gaze toward an unusual and unsettling obsession: the idea that human bloodlines could be studied, perfected, and, in some cases, manipulated. It was a vision that promised answers to questions no one else dared ask, yet it teetered on the boundary between genius and madness, and it is precisely this tension that made it both fascinating and horrifying. The laboratory where much of this work occurred was modest by modern standards, tucked away behind an unremarkable manor on the outskirts of a small Bavarian town. To the casual observer, it might have seemed little more than a private study or an eccentric collector's den, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of purpose, secrecy, and an almost tangible obsession. Glass vials and rudimentary microscopes lined the shelves, alongside meticulously organized notebooks filled with handwriting so precise it seemed almost unnatural. Every detail, every measurement, every observation was recorded with a devotion that spoke not only to scientific rigor but to a deeper, more unsettling compulsion. The air carried the faint, metallic tang of chemicals and the smell of pressed herbs used in preservation techniques, a scent that seemed to cling to the very walls of the manor. Outside, the snow-dusted Bavarian landscape moved quietly, oblivious to the human dramas unfolding inside. What drove these men and women to pursue such experiments was not merely curiosity, though curiosity played a role. It was a belief, almost a fanaticism, that the secrets of heredity could unlock something profound, something that could elevate the human condition, or at least a select portion of it. Aristocratic families, proud of their lineage and obsessed with maintaining purity in bloodlines, offered their children and estates as instruments for these investigations. In return, the scientists promised knowledge, insight, and sometimes prestige. But the bargain was far darker than either side fully admitted. Children were measured, photographed, and subjected to tests that would today be considered wholly unethical. Families were studied across generations, each union, each birth, each death meticulously documented. The very notion that traits, temperaments, and abilities could be traced through blood fascinated the researchers, yet it also stripped the human subjects of autonomy, reducing them to living datasets in a pursuit few would dare to acknowledge publicly. The tone within the manor was one of eerie calm, a quiet intensity that suggested both discipline and an undercurrent of something more sinister. Conversation was deliberate, almost formal, as though the act of speaking might disturb the delicate balance of observation. Journals from the era hint at moments of unease, notations about children who did not thrive, adults who reacted unpredictably, and the occasional question of morality. Yet, these concerns were often dismissed or rationalized, brushed aside as minor obstacles in the march toward understanding. There is something deeply unsettling about this rationalization, the way the researchers could compartmentalize what they were doing, treating human beings not as living, breathing individuals, but as variables, as specimens to be dissected in the abstract. It is this tension, the collision of ambition, curiosity, and morality, that forms the heartbeat of the story, that draws the audience in and refuses to let go. In many ways, the experiments of 1889 Bavaria can be seen as a reflection of the broader cultural and scientific zeitgeist. Europe was awash with ideas of progress, yet these same ideas often masked darker impulses, the desire to control, to categorize, to improve not just machines and cities, but life itself according to human whim. In this context, bloodline science seemed both logical and terrifyingly audacious. It promised answers that no one else had, insights into the essence of heredity, the potential to predict and shape the future of families, even entire populations. Yet, it also raised profound questions that went unanswered, questions about free will, consent, and the human cost of knowledge. Every new observation brought a mixture of exhilaration and unease, a sense that the line between discovery and transgression was perilously thin. Even today, the allure of such hidden histories is undeniable. There is a natural fascination in peering into the shadows of the past, in exploring what was deliberately abandoned or forgotten. The story of Bavaria's bloodline experiments is not one of wild scandal or sensationalized horror. It is quieter, subtler, and in some ways, far more chilling. The secrecy surrounding the work, the meticulous records that were buried, and the very deliberate abandonment of the research all contribute to a sense that something profound, unsettling, and morally ambiguous was lost to time. As viewers, we are drawn not only to the facts themselves but to the questions they raise. What were these scientists truly seeking? How far were they willing to go? And why was it all erased from history so completely? This narrative is further intensified by the very specificity of its location and time. Bavaria in 1889 was neither the teeming metropolis nor the backwater village that might be expected. It was something in between, a place where old-world traditions met the stirrings of modernity. Castles and manors stood alongside laboratories and modest townhouses. Folk beliefs about fate, family, and inherited traits coexisted with the newest scientific theories, creating a society uniquely poised for experimentation. It is in this fertile yet morally ambiguous soil that bloodline science found its roots, drawing on both superstition and science, obsession and ambition. As the first glimpses of this hidden world emerge, viewers are invited into a story that is as much about human nature as it is about science. The tension between curiosity and morality, ambition and ethics, secrecy and exposure, forms the backbone of a narrative that is equal parts history, mystery, and macabre fascination. By entering this world, one begins to understand not only the specific events of 1889 Bavaria but also the broader patterns of human behavior that allow such experiments to occur, be abandoned, and then almost entirely forgotten. It is a story that lingers in the mind, haunting and provocative, challenging the viewer to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and, perhaps, about themselves. Bavaria in 1889 was a land of contradictions, a place where old-world traditions collided with the surge of modern science, creating an atmosphere ripe for both progress and peril. On the surface, it was a picturesque region, dotted with quaint villages, dense forests, and castles that had stood for centuries, silent witnesses to the passage of time. Yet beneath this serene facade, a quieter, more complex story was unfolding, a story of intellectual ambition, obsession, and a society increasingly fascinated by the mysteries of heredity and human nature. The region's cultural fabric was woven from threads of folklore, aristocratic privilege, and a rigid social hierarchy, each influencing the way people thought about family, bloodlines, and inherited traits. In such an environment, the idea that science could uncover the hidden rules of life was both tantalizing and terrifying. The Bavarian landscape itself mirrored this duality. Rolling hills and dense woodlands seemed timeless, almost eternal, while towns and cities were beginning to hum with the mechanical heartbeat of modernity. Steam trains chugged along newly laid tracks, factories hummed with the noise of progress, and universities attracted scholars eager to explore uncharted realms of knowledge. Yet despite this modernization, old superstitions and local beliefs persisted. Many Bavarians still adhered to notions of fate, divine providence, and the mystical qualities of bloodlines, especially among the nobility. Families believed that character traits, temperament, and even destiny could be passed down from one generation to the next. This belief in hereditary influence made the society unusually receptive to experimental approaches in genetics, eugenics, and what would later be called bloodline science. The fascination was not purely scientific. It was also deeply entwined with notions of status, lineage, and power. At the heart of these developments was a tension between the rational and the mystical. Universities and laboratories promoted methodical observation, meticulous record-keeping, and systematic experimentation. Scholars debated Mendelian inheritance, the beginnings of what we now understand as genetics, and the possibilities of selectively studying human and animal traits. Meanwhile, folklore and superstition lingered in everyday life, from whispered tales of cursed bloodlines to the pervasive belief that noble families carried an almost sacred responsibility to maintain the purity of their lineage. In this intersection of science and superstition, ambitious researchers found fertile ground for their experiments. They could justify invasive studies on children, families, and animals under the guise of advancing human understanding, while society often turned a blind eye, either out of fascination or a reluctance to challenge powerful patrons. The political climate in Bavaria also played a crucial role. The late 19th century was a period of relative stability under the Wittelsbach monarchy, yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. Aristocrats wielded immense influence, not just politically but socially, setting standards for behavior, marriage, and inheritance. Their interest in bloodline science was not purely academic. It was personal. Many sought assurance that the traits they prized, intelligence, temperament, physical health, even artistic or martial ability, would persist within their families. Wealthy families willingly contributed to experiments, offering access to generations of data, in the form of family records, genealogies, and sometimes living subjects. In exchange, scientists gained unprecedented insight into heredity, while the families involved received the promise of understanding and potentially enhancing their lineages. Yet this seemingly symbiotic relationship masked a darker truth. The lives of the individuals involved were often treated as expendable, secondary to the pursuit of knowledge. Social norms and gender roles of the time further complicated the situation. Women, especially, were often seen as vessels for reproduction, their genetic contribution carefully monitored, while children were treated as living embodiments of hereditary experiments. Male researchers recorded observations with meticulous care, tracking minute details of growth, behavior, and physical traits. Diaries and notes from this period describe children as specimens or living records, revealing a chilling detachment. The emotional and psychological impact on these young subjects went largely unexamined, their voices muted in the shadow of scientific ambition. This contrast between meticulous attention to data and neglect of human suffering highlights the ethical blind spots that allowed such experimentation to flourish. The scientific community itself was in a state of flux. Genetics was not yet formalized, and theories about heredity were often speculative, drawing on both observation and conjecture. While some researchers sought to uncover universal laws, others were more interested in proving preconceived notions about superior bloodlines or inherited intelligence. This mixture of ambition, ego, and incomplete knowledge created an environment where extraordinary discoveries could occur alongside profound ethical transgressions. Scholars corresponded in private letters, exchanging observations, debating methodology, and sometimes boasting about their ability to predict and influence hereditary outcomes. Yet these conversations often occurred in isolation, removed from public scrutiny, reinforcing the secrecy that would later obscure much of this work from historical record. It is also important to consider the broader European context. Bavaria was not isolated. It was part of a continent increasingly obsessed with classification, measurement, and improvement. Across Europe, societies were grappling with questions about human potential, the meaning of heredity, and the implications of scientific intervention. Influential figures, from Darwin to Galton, had introduced ideas that challenged moral and social norms, opening the door for experimentation that combined both promise and peril. Bavaria, with its unique combination of aristocratic patronage, intellectual curiosity, and lingering superstition, became a crucible for these ideas. It was here that bloodline science found both its opportunities and its vulnerabilities, a place where ambition could flourish in the shadows while ethical oversight remained minimal. The combination of landscape, culture, politics, and science created a fertile yet morally ambiguous environment. Researchers were emboldened, families were intrigued, and society at large was largely indifferent or fascinated. This delicate balance between curiosity and caution, progress and tradition, gave rise to a form of experimentation that was meticulous, obsessive, and chillingly detached from human cost. In the forests, manors, and laboratories of Bavaria, generations were tracked, studied, and sometimes manipulated, all in the name of discovery. The work was never violent in the overt sense, but its consequences, emotional, psychological, and ethical, echoed far beyond the laboratory walls. Understanding Bavaria in 1889 is essential to understanding the story of bloodline science itself. Without this context, the interplay of social hierarchy, superstition, political stability, and scientific curiosity, the experiments that followed cannot be fully grasped. It is a world simultaneously familiar and alien, where human ambition collided with nascent science in ways that would leave lasting, though largely invisible, traces. The environment itself, with its mixture of tradition and transformation, mirrors the experiments that would take place within it: meticulous, ambitious, morally complex, and quietly unsettling. By stepping into this Bavaria, we begin to see not only the origins of a strange scientific pursuit but also the cultural and societal forces that made it possible, illuminating the dark and intricate web from which bloodline science would emerge and eventually vanish. At the center of the unfolding story in Bavaria were the men and women who dared to tread where others feared to look, individuals whose ambition, curiosity, and intellect drove them into morally ambiguous territory. These were the pioneers of a nascent form of science, a study that sought to map the human soul through the veins and blood of generations. Some were formally trained scientists, steeped in the limited but rapidly expanding knowledge of heredity and anatomy. Others were aristocrats or wealthy patrons whose interest in the purity and perfection of their lineages provided both funding and subjects for research. Together, they formed a network that was equal parts collaboration and competition, united by a shared belief in the transformative potential of bloodline science. Among the most prominent figures were men whose reputations today are almost entirely forgotten, their names lost to time, yet in 1889 they commanded respect and influence within their circles. They were meticulous in their work, often keeping multiple journals, sketchbooks, and ledgers to track everything from physical development to temperament and intelligence. Their writing is clinical, detached, and sometimes chilling in its precision, revealing minds consumed by the pursuit of patterns in heredity. Every birth, every death, every minor anomaly became data, carefully recorded and analyzed. Diaries from the era reveal moments of fascination tinged with unease, notes about a child's unusually strong will, another's fragile constitution, observations about siblings who shared strikingly similar traits. The researchers were obsessed with the idea that these patterns held secrets that could illuminate not only the human body but the human spirit itself. Equally important were the aristocratic patrons who supported and enabled the work. These families were driven by a mix of pride, superstition, and genuine curiosity. To them, lineage was sacred, an inheritance that demanded careful stewardship. They were intrigued by the notion that science could confirm their superiority, predict the traits of future generations, or even enhance the qualities they most valued. For these families, participating in experiments was both a privilege and a responsibility, a chance to contribute to knowledge while safeguarding their own bloodline. Yet the exchange was not without cost. Children were subjected to measurements, observations, and tests that, by today's standards, would be considered invasive and unethical. Families were drawn into the researchers' obsessive attention to detail, their everyday lives transformed into a living laboratory. The personal motivations of the scientists were as varied as their methods. Some were genuinely curious, driven by a desire to understand the mechanisms of heredity and the transmission of traits. Others were more ambitious, seeking fame, recognition, or even financial gain through discoveries that could enhance their reputations. Letters between researchers reveal subtle rivalries, debates over methodology, and occasional boasting about results that might have been ethically questionable. Some expressed frustration when a particular trait could not be observed or predicted, while others celebrated the smallest anomalies as breakthroughs. This combination of ambition and obsession created an atmosphere charged with tension, where every observation carried significance and every failure risked professional embarrassment or ridicule. While male scientists often held the positions of authority, women played a less visible but nonetheless critical role in the experiments. They served as assistants, record keepers, and sometimes as subjects themselves, especially in cases where maternal lineage was of particular interest. In some instances, aristocratic women willingly participated to help map traits across generations, meticulously noting every detail about their children and household. Their contributions, though largely unrecognized in historical accounts, were essential to the meticulous record-keeping that defined the experiments. Yet even as women contributed to the work, their voices were often mediated through the language and priorities of male scientists, their perspectives reduced to the data they could provide. The methodologies employed by these early pioneers were a blend of observation, measurement, and rudimentary experimentation. They measured body proportions, recorded growth patterns, and catalogued behaviors, seeking correlations that might reveal the hidden logic of heredity. Some experiments involved cross-generational comparisons, noting the recurrence of certain traits across siblings and cousins. Others attempted to manipulate outcomes by controlling which marriages occurred or which individuals were studied most closely. While these techniques were crude compared to modern genetics, the level of precision and attention to detail was remarkable. Sketches, charts, and graphs from the period reveal a methodical approach, a determination to extract meaning from patterns that others might dismiss as coincidental. There was also a psychological dimension to the work that is often overlooked. The researchers were not merely cataloguing physical traits, they were attempting to understand temperament, intelligence, and personality through heredity. Notes describe children's responses to stress, curiosity, emotional reactions, and problem-solving abilities, all carefully observed and recorded. The goal was to map not just the body but the mind, to discern whether courage, creativity, or moral disposition could be traced through generations. This ambition, however, often veered into the ethically troubling. Subjects were studied without full consent, families were monitored with the assumption that science outweighed personal autonomy, and the potential harm caused by the experiments was largely ignored. Despite their ambition, these figures were also acutely aware of the social and moral boundaries they navigated. Diaries occasionally reveal doubts, fleeting moments where the weight of their actions seemed to register. A note might describe a child's distress or a family's unease, followed by a rationalization that the pursuit of knowledge justified the means. This tension between curiosity and conscience is part of what makes their story so compelling. They were brilliant, meticulous, and imaginative, yet capable of detachment so profound that ordinary ethical considerations were subordinated to the goals of science. The interplay of genius and moral ambiguity creates a sense of both fascination and horror, a duality that echoes throughout the narrative of Bloodline science. The network of scientists and patrons was further strengthened by correspondence and travel. Researchers exchanged letters detailing methods, observations, and questions, often comparing notes across regions and even countries. Aristocratic families hosted salons and gatherings where ideas were discussed, findings presented, and future plans debated. These interactions created a sense of legitimacy, a shared understanding that the work, though unconventional, was part of a larger scientific enterprise. Yet the secrecy inherent in the experiments was never far from the surface. Many records were deliberately obscure, notes coded or hidden, ensuring that only those within the circle could fully comprehend the scope of the work. What emerges from examining these figures is a complex portrait of ambition, intellect, and moral ambiguity. They were driven by curiosity, pride, and a desire to leave a mark on the world, yet their work came at a human cost that they often rationalized or ignored. The juxtaposition of meticulous scientific observation and the ethical compromises it entailed is central to understanding why Bloodline science, despite its apparent promise, was ultimately abandoned. It was not simply the failure of methodology or lack of resources that led to its quiet disappearance. It was the recognition, even if only subconscious, that the pursuit of knowledge in this realm could exact a profound and disturbing toll. By focusing on the scientists and aristocrats at the center of this story, we begin to understand the human dimension behind the historical record. The choices they made, the obsessions they pursued, and the rationalizations they employed provide insight into the society and culture of Bavaria in 1889, as well as the universal tensions between curiosity, ambition, and morality. Their lives, their notebooks, and their correspondence are more than historical artifacts. They are windows into a world where the promise of knowledge was inseparable from a shadow of human cost, a world that continues to haunt us precisely because it reflects both the brilliance and the darkness inherent in human ambition. The experiments that unfolded within the shadowed halls of Bavarian manors in 1889 were at once meticulous and macabre, a blend of early scientific inquiry and a fascination with the human lineage that teetered on the edge of obsession. These were not casual studies, nor were they driven solely by curiosity. They were deliberate, methodical attempts to uncover the hidden architecture of heredity, to map traits and temperaments as if human beings were no more than living manuscripts written in blood. The researchers were driven by an almost religious conviction that the secrets of the family line could reveal universal truths, that the patterns observed in one generation might predict the character and fate of the next. To them, the blood of the aristocracy, the traits of the nobility, and even the mundane qualities of common folk were data points in a vast and intricate experiment stretching across time and family trees. The methodologies they employed were surprisingly sophisticated for the era, combining observation, measurement, and rudimentary forms of genetic tracking. Children were measured from birth, their limbs, cranial structure, and bodily proportions documented with obsessive precision. Diaries from the time described the children being photographed at regular intervals, sometimes daily, to capture growth patterns and subtle changes in physical development. These images, carefully labeled and annotated, served as both scientific records and eerie visual reminders of the researcher's gaze. Even minor anomalies were noted with fascination: the slant of an eye, the curl of a finger, a persistent cough, or unusual sleep pattern. Each detail, however small, was treated as a potential clue, a fragment of the puzzle the scientists were desperate to solve. The experiments were not limited to physical traits alone. Temperament, intelligence, and moral disposition were scrutinized with equal intensity. Children were observed in both controlled and everyday environments, their reactions to stress, authority, and peer interaction recorded in painstaking detail. Some researchers devised rudimentary tests to measure problem-solving ability or creativity, while others relied on anecdotal observations from parents and household staff. The goal was to correlate behavior with heredity, to determine whether courage, curiosity, or even moral inclination could be predicted through bloodline. In essence, The researchers were attempting to chart the invisible threads of character across generations, a pursuit that blurred the boundaries between science and speculation. Animal studies ran alongside human observation, often providing a disturbing mirror for the researchers' work. Dogs, cats, and even livestock were bred selectively to track hereditary traits, and their physical and behavioral patterns were meticulously recorded. These experiments were used to justify the methodology applied to human subjects, under the belief that understanding the inheritance of traits in animals could illuminate the principles at work in humans. Yet the line between human and animal study was disturbingly thin. Some diaries describe comparisons between siblings and offspring in ways that suggest a reduction of human life to a kind of natural experiment, a living data set to be manipulated and monitored without consent. One of the most chilling aspects of these experiments was the attempt to influence outcomes through selective pairing. Aristocratic families, invested in the perceived purity of their lineage, sometimes participated willingly, arranging marriages or encouraging unions that would allow the researchers to observe the transmission of traits. The aim was to see if intelligence, physical ability, or temperament could be preserved, amplified, or even enhanced through careful control of heredity. In some cases, children were evaluated with the same criteria applied to livestock, their value assessed according to the traits they carried and the potential they represented for the family's bloodline. This practice, while methodically documented, raises profound ethical questions, highlighting the tension between scientific curiosity and human cost that defined the work of this era. Despite the cold precision of their methods, the experiments were deeply human in their impact. Diaries and correspondence reveal moments of doubt, worry, and even guilt among the researchers, though these feelings were often rationalized or suppressed. Notations about a child's distress, an unexpected emotional response, or a family's unease were usually followed by reminders of the importance of the work, the potential knowledge to be gained, and the belief that the end justified the means. In this sense, the laboratories of Bavaria were not only sites of scientific observation but also theaters of moral negotiation, where the boundaries of acceptable behavior were constantly tested and redefined. The meticulous tracking of traits extended across generations. Families were studied over decades, with genealogies meticulously recorded to trace the inheritance of both physical and behavioral characteristics. Researchers often returned to the same families repeatedly, noting the traits of new offspring, comparing them with older siblings, and documenting any deviations from the patterns they expected. The records that survive, though fragmentary, reveal a level of detail and dedication that is both awe-inspiring and profoundly unsettling. One can imagine the quiet intensity in the manor rooms, children sitting for measurements, aristocrats consulting with scientists, assistants recording every motion, every nuance, every expression, as though life itself had become a data point. The consequences of these experiments were both immediate and long-lasting. Children grew up under constant observation, their lives subtly shaped by the presence of the researchers. Families were drawn into a web of scrutiny that extended beyond the walls of the laboratories, influencing marriages, education, and social interactions. The psychological toll on these subjects, though rarely documented in their own words, must have been profound. Diaries occasionally hint at moments of resistance, discomfort, or fear, but the prevailing narrative is one of control and compliance, enforced by social pressure, familial expectation, and the authority of the researchers. It is also essential to recognize the intellectual context in which these experiments were conducted. Genetics was in its infancy, Mendelian principles had only begun to circulate, and the understanding of heredity was incomplete. Researchers filled gaps in knowledge with conjecture, intuition, and careful observation, blending rigorous methodology with speculative interpretation. This combination of precision and imagination is part of what made the experiments compelling, but it also contributed to their ethical ambiguity. The very act of seeking patterns in human traits, while scientifically ambitious, carried profound implications for autonomy, consent, and human dignity. The laboratories themselves were designed to facilitate this intricate study of life and heredity. Rooms were arranged to allow both observation and measurement, often with hidden spaces where assistants could monitor subjects unobtrusively. Tools of the trade, microscopes, calipers, scales, and measuring tapes, were combined with more unusual apparatus, reflecting the blend of scientific curiosity and experimental improvisation. Specimens were preserved, sketches were meticulously drawn, and notebooks were updated with near-daily entries. Every detail mattered, every anomaly could be a key to understanding the hereditary puzzle, and the atmosphere of quiet obsession was palpable to anyone who stepped inside. Ultimately, The experiments of 1889 Bavaria represent a fascinating and unsettling intersection of curiosity, ambition, and morality. They reveal a society and a scientific community willing to explore the boundaries of human knowledge, yet often blind to the consequences for the individuals involved. The combination of meticulous observation, selective breeding, and psychological monitoring created a body of work that was both groundbreaking and ethically troubling. While many of the findings would be abandoned, hidden, or forgotten, the legacy of these experiments lingers, offering a window into a world where the pursuit of knowledge could blur the line between science and obsession, curiosity and cruelty. Behind every observation, every measurement, and every note in the meticulous journals of Bavarian bloodline science were the lives of real people, individuals who became both the subjects and, often unknowingly, the victims of this obsessive pursuit. These families were drawn into a world of quiet scrutiny, their homes and lives transformed into living laboratories, where the everyday rhythms of childhood and family life were disrupted by the relentless gaze of science. Children were observed from the moment of birth, their growth, behavior, and even emotions catalogued with clinical precision. Diaries describe infants being measured, weighed, and photographed almost as ritualistic acts, while parents were instructed to report every minor deviation in behavior, every fleeting emotional response. In this environment, privacy was nearly non-existent, and the very concept of a childhood free from intrusion had little meaning. The impact on the children themselves is difficult to fully quantify, but surviving accounts hint at the psychological strain imposed by constant observation. Some children reportedly became unusually self-conscious, aware that their actions, words, and even moods were being recorded for purposes beyond their understanding. Others reacted with anxiety, withdrawal, or defiance, subtle signs of stress that were often interpreted by the researchers as interesting data points rather than cries for empathy. In a sense, the children were doubly trapped, first, by the expectations of their families, who hoped for validation of their lineage, and second, by the obsessive attention of the scientists, who reduced human life to a pattern of traits to be measured, compared, and analyzed. The line between care and control blurred, leaving a lingering shadow over the daily lives of these young subjects. Parents, too, bore a heavy burden. Aristocratic families, driven by the desire to preserve or enhance their lineage, were often complicit in the experiments, yet this complicity was rarely without tension. Mothers and fathers were instructed on how to monitor their children, how to record observations, and, in some cases, how to influence development in ways the researchers deemed favorable. Letters and journals from the time reveal a complex mix of pride, fear, and doubt. Some parents were enthralled by the promise of scientific insight, eager to see whether the qualities they valued most could be preserved or strengthened in their offspring. Others quietly questioned the morality of the work, noticing the strain on their children or the invasive nature of the procedures, yet felt powerless to intervene. Social pressure and the authority of the researchers created an environment in which dissent was difficult, leaving families caught between curiosity, ambition, and ethical unease. Siblings were often compared to one another with relentless precision. Diaries contain entries detailing minute differences in temperament, intelligence, and physical development, creating a quiet hierarchy within the family itself. Some children were labeled as more promising, others as weaker or less capable, based on traits that were catalogued in notebooks rather than observed with empathy. This hierarchical comparison, while scientifically motivated, had profound emotional consequences. It shaped relationships, self-perception, and the expectations placed upon each child, subtly altering the dynamics of family life. In this way, the experiments extended beyond the walls of the laboratory, infiltrating the intimate spaces of the home and the delicate web of family relationships. The social ramifications of participation were equally significant. Families involved in these studies were often well known in their communities, and the secrecy surrounding the research created a layer of tension and isolation. In some cases, gossip and rumor would circulate about unusual practices or the obsessive attention given to certain children, heightening the pressure to comply and to maintain appearances. The desire to protect reputation and social standing reinforced the authority of the researchers, while simultaneously embedding the families deeper into the web of observation and control. It was a subtle but powerful form of social coercion, one that ensured participation even when discomfort or moral doubt arose. The meticulous records kept by researchers and families alike also reveal the broader ambitions of the Bloodline science project. These were not isolated observations. The goal was to trace patterns across generations, to connect traits from grandparents to grandchildren, to map inherited strengths and weaknesses with painstaking detail. Families became living archives, their histories recorded in volumes of notebooks, photographs, and sketches. Some of the traits catalogued were mundane: hair color, height, or eye shape. Others were far more consequential: temperament, intelligence, and even tendencies towards certain illnesses or behaviors. The comprehensive nature of these records reflects both the researcher's ambition and the vulnerability of the families involved, whose lives were transformed into a kind of ongoing experiment in heredity. In some cases, the intrusion extended to social behavior and moral development. Children were observed in classrooms, during play, and in interactions with servants or peers. Notes would describe responses to authority, reactions to challenges, and patterns of cooperation or defiance. Researchers believed that such behaviors were not random but inherited, and they sought to quantify them in the same way as physical traits. The effect on the children was subtle but profound, instilling a sense that they were constantly under evaluation, that their worth and future were being measured against an invisible standard. This form of psychological pressure, while unintentional in its cruelty, nonetheless shaped their experiences and identities. It is impossible to overlook the ethical implications of these practices. The families involved were living under a system that prioritized scientific curiosity above personal autonomy, reducing individuals to data points in a pursuit whose consequences were largely unknown. The children had little agency, the parents limited influence, and the researchers wielded authority in ways that were both formal and deeply personal. The line between cooperation and coercion was often blurred, and the moral compromises inherent in the work were rarely acknowledged. Yet, in the context of 1889 Bavaria, such compromises were normalized, embedded in the cultural, social, and intellectual fabric of the time. Despite the burdens, some families found a sense of purpose or pride in participation. They were contributing to the advancement of knowledge, preserving their lineage, and engaging with science in ways few others could. For them, the meticulous record-keeping and observation carried a sense of legitimacy and prestige. Yet this pride was always shadowed by the quiet acknowledgement that the work demanded sacrifices, and that the human cost, though invisible in official records, was ever present. The duality of fascination and unease is central to understanding the human dimension of bloodline science. It is a story of ambition and curiosity, but also of control, pressure, and moral compromise. Ultimately, the families at the center of these experiments were as much a part of the story as the scientists themselves. Their daily lives, their emotions, and their responses to observation shaped the trajectory of the research, while also revealing the profound human consequences of a scientific pursuit that blurred the line between knowledge and intrusion. They were living witnesses to the possibilities and dangers of early bloodline science, participants in a narrative that combined meticulous observation with moral ambiguity, fascination with dread, and curiosity with ethical compromise. The story of these families is not just a historical footnote. It is a lens through which we can understand the human cost of scientific ambition, and the ways in which obsession, secrecy, and desire for knowledge can ripple through the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary ways. In the dimly lit study rooms and cluttered laboratories of Bavaria, the pursuit of bloodline science was marked not only by curiosity and meticulous observation but also by a profound ethical blind spot that permeated every decision, every note, every experiment. The researchers involved were brilliant, methodical, and often deeply committed to the idea that knowledge could be extracted from human heredity in ways that had never been attempted before. Yet beneath their meticulous methodology lay a troubling detachment, a willingness to prioritize data over human dignity, observation over consent, and ambition over morality. This ethical blind spot was not always a product of malice. It was frequently the result of a cultural and scientific environment that failed to question the limits of acceptable inquiry, where societal reverence for aristocratic lineage and faith in scientific progress created a permissive atmosphere for morally ambiguous experimentation. At the heart of this ethical tension was the assumption that the pursuit of knowledge justified nearly any action. Researchers often rationalized the intrusion into family life and the scrutiny of children as necessary sacrifices for the advancement of science. Diaries and letters from the period reveal moments when researchers noted distress, discomfort, or even suffering among their subjects, only to quickly dismiss these observations as unfortunate but inevitable byproducts of the work. Children who cried during measurements, mothers who hesitated to follow detailed instructions, and siblings who resisted the constraints imposed by observation were all interpreted not as expressions of human agency but as variables to be accounted for, anomalies to be documented and adjusted for in subsequent experiments. This rationalization reveals a mindset in which the human cost was abstracted, reduced to data points, and weighed lightly against the promise of discovery. Compounding this detachment was the authority afforded to researchers by both the state and the aristocracy. Bavaria in 1889 was a hierarchical society, deeply respectful of scientific and intellectual achievement, especially when supported by noble families. Researchers were granted extraordinary access to private homes, families, and children, often operating with little oversight beyond the expectations of their patrons. The combination of prestige, autonomy, and social reverence created conditions in which ethical considerations were frequently subordinated to professional ambition. Even when moments of doubt or discomfort arose, the structural support surrounding the researchers enabled them to continue largely unchallenged, reinforcing the permissiveness of their environment. The blind spot extended beyond individuals to encompass the broader cultural assumptions of the time. Society held a quasi-religious belief in the significance of bloodlines, particularly among the nobility, where lineage was equated with worth, intelligence, and moral standing. This cultural framework lent legitimacy to the idea that traits could and should be studied, preserved, and, if possible, enhanced. Within this context, monitoring children, influencing marriages, and documenting behaviors were often seen as responsible acts rather than morally questionable intrusions. Ethical reflection was rare, and when it did surface, it was frequently couched in scientific language, framed as a necessary tension between observation and consequence, data and human experience. A further dimension of this ethical blind spot was the selective application of moral concern. Researchers often expressed care or curiosity for certain outcomes while remaining indifferent to others. A child who exhibited the traits deemed desirable, intelligence, composure, or physical aptitude, might receive more attention, while those who deviated from expected patterns were sometimes marginalized, reduced to anomalies or failures in the dataset. This selective attention reinforced patterns of bias, both conscious and unconscious, and illuminated a disturbing calculus in which the value of a human life was measured against its perceived contribution to the experiment. The inherent inequality in this system created a hierarchy not just of data but of human worth, an imbalance that was rarely questioned within the insular circles of researchers and patrons. The ethical ambiguity was also evident in the manipulation of family dynamics. In some cases, marriages were influenced or encouraged to produce offspring with certain traits, children were evaluated against siblings, and families were subtly coerced into participation through social pressure, expectation, and appeals to prestige. The researchers' interventions, while framed as scientific guidance, often encroached upon personal autonomy and reshaped family relationships in ways that were rarely acknowledged. Parents were caught between social aspiration, familial pride, and moral discomfort, navigating a world where the authority of science was both compelling and coercive. The ethical blind spot was thus systemic, embedded not only in individual decision-making but in the structures and social conventions that supported and amplified the research. Even within the scientific journals themselves, one can trace the contours of this moral detachment. Observations are written in clinical, almost cold language, with emotions, distress, and human suffering catalogued as though they were mere variables. Terms like specimen, observation subject, and data point recur frequently, reflecting a mindset that valued precision and pattern recognition above human experience. While there are rare moments of hesitation, doubt, or reflection, they are typically overshadowed by the drive to collect, record, and analyze. The language itself becomes a lens through which the ethical blind spot is rendered visible, a subtle but powerful indicator of how ambition, culture, and authority shape the moral compass of those involved. In many ways, the ethical failures of Bavarian bloodline science in 1889 were not solely the result of individual choices but a reflection of a broader tension between emerging scientific power and societal values. The promise of discovery, the allure of understanding heredity, and the prestige of intellectual achievement created conditions in which moral reflection was often secondary. Researchers could pursue hypotheses, observe families, and experiment with minimal scrutiny because the environment itself reinforced the notion that such pursuits were both necessary and justified. The ethical blind spot, then, was not merely personal. It was structural, cultural, and systemic, arising from a convergence of ambition, reverence for science, and the permissive social hierarchy of the time. Yet despite this detachment, the consequences were deeply human. Children grew up under observation, their actions catalogued and interpreted in ways they could not understand. Families navigated complex pressures, balancing pride, ambition, and concern for their children's well-being. Researchers, even at their most meticulous and rational, were engaged in a process that carried profound moral implications, ones that would echo long after the experiments themselves were abandoned. The blind spot allowed them to continue their work, but it also ensured that the story of bloodline science would be marked by ambiguity, fascination, and a lingering sense of unease. By examining this ethical landscape, one gains insight into the moral and psychological dimensions of the research. The blind spot illuminates not only the ambitions and methods of the scientists, but also the societal structures and cultural assumptions that made such work possible. It reveals a world in which curiosity could override conscience, observation could eclipse empathy, and the pursuit of knowledge could quietly reshape human lives. In doing so, it forces us to confront enduring questions about the costs of discovery, the limits of ambition, and the ways in which human values intersect with the ever-expanding reach of science. As the years passed and the meticulous observation of families continued in Bavaria, the researchers began to identify patterns, subtle, sometimes extraordinary, and occasionally deeply disturbing, that they believed revealed the hidden truths of heredity. These were not casual insights but carefully documented correlations that emerged from decades of patient recording, measurements, and observation. Every birth, every growth chart, every anecdotal account of temperament or intellect contributed to a vast and intricate tapestry, a map of human traits as they passed from one generation to the next. To the scientists, these findings were exhilarating. To the families involved, they were often invisible, quietly shaping lives under the weight of observation. Some of the most striking observations centered on physical anomalies, traits that recurred across generations with an almost obsessive regularity. Researchers noted unusual skeletal structures, rare eye or hair color combinations, and peculiar facial features that seemed to appear in clusters within certain bloodlines. In some cases, these traits were celebrated as markers of nobility, intelligence, or vigor. In others, they were recorded with a clinical fascination, catalogued as deviations, curiosities, or anomalies to be studied further. The meticulousness of these records is remarkable. Measurements were taken with calipers, photographs captured the slightest changes, and sketches were rendered with precision to compare subtle traits across family members. To a modern observer, the level of detail conveys both dedication and a chilling detachment, as though the researchers were curating a gallery of human variation rather than studying living people. Yet the fascination of the scientists was not limited to the physical. Behavioral traits, temperament, intelligence, artistic ability, and even moral inclination were scrutinized with equal intensity. Some families exhibited patterns that suggested extraordinary aptitude in particular areas. A lineage might consistently produce children with acute memory, remarkable artistic talent, or a calculated temperament that the researchers interpreted as evidence of inherited aptitude. In other lines, patterns of emotional fragility, impulsivity, or moral deviation were documented with equal rigor. The scientists saw these traits as windows into the workings of heredity, clues that could eventually allow them to predict the character and potential of future generations. Yet in doing so, they often reduced complex human behaviors to simplistic patterns, neglecting the unpredictable influence of environment, experience, and individual choice. Perhaps most chilling were the observations of health anomalies and hereditary diseases. The researchers meticulously recorded occurrences of conditions such as epilepsy, congenital deformities, and various mental or neurological disorders, tracing their passage through generations with painstaking care. While some of these studies were purely observational, others crossed into the realm of manipulation, as families were sometimes guided to reproduce in ways that might reveal the inheritance of certain traits. The ethical implications were profound. The drive to uncover patterns often meant that suffering was tolerated, observed, and recorded as though it was simply another data point. There is a quiet horror in imagining the families who bore these experiments, living under the shadow of curiosity, their private struggles transformed into material for scientific scrutiny. Despite these ethical concerns, the findings themselves were undeniably compelling, at least to the researchers. The recurrence of traits across generations suggested that heredity might be mapped with greater precision than previously imagined. Some patterns were predictable, such as the inheritance of eye color or stature, but others were startlingly complex, hinting at a deeper, almost mystical logic in the transmission of traits. The researchers became increasingly confident that they were uncovering fundamental principles of human heredity, that their observations might one day enable the prediction, and perhaps even the control, of human development. This belief, however, carried a double-edged consequence. It lent legitimacy to continued intrusion into the lives of families and children, while simultaneously embedding assumptions about human worth, ability, and destiny into the very methodology of the study. In addition to physical and behavioral traits, researchers were fascinated by the possibility of hereditary talent or predisposition. Certain families seemed to produce generations of artists, musicians, or scholars, while others displayed consistent aptitude for leadership, strategic thinking, or martial ability. These patterns were interpreted as evidence of a kind of genetic determinism, a belief that personal qualities could be traced as reliably as eye color or height. The implications were enormous. If heredity could account for not only physical traits but also intellect and character, then human potential could theoretically be predicted, nurtured, or even manipulated. It is easy to see why such findings, even if speculative, would capture the imagination of both scientists and aristocratic families, who had long been obsessed with lineage, legacy, and inherited distinction. Yet not all findings were celebrated or straightforward. Some families displayed traits that defied easy explanation, behaviors, or conditions that seemed to skip generations or appear sporadically, confounding the researchers' attempts to draw definitive conclusions. These anomalies became objects of fascination in themselves, recorded with obsessive detail, as though each exception was a puzzle piece that might one day complete a broader picture. In this way, the experiments in Bavaria were not only about confirming hypotheses but also about cataloguing the inexplicable, the unexpected, and the anomalous. The tension between pattern and anomaly heightened both the scientific ambition and the sense of unease surrounding the research. The documentation of these findings was exhaustive. Volumes of notebooks, meticulously labeled photographs, sketches, and charts were produced to track every observation. Researchers compared families not only within Bavaria but across regions, noting similarities and differences with the hope of uncovering universal laws of inheritance. The scale and ambition of this record-keeping is remarkable, especially given the limited scientific tools available at the time. Each observation carried weight. Each anomaly was a potential breakthrough. And yet, in the midst of this rigor, the human dimension, the suffering, the emotional strain, and the social consequences for families, was largely invisible in the official record. It existed only in fleeting, marginal notations, glimpses of discomfort or hesitation that were quickly rationalized or overlooked. What emerges from these studies is a dual legacy, one of profound insight and one of haunting ethical ambiguity. The researchers glimpsed patterns that were genuinely groundbreaking, uncovering aspects of heredity that remain relevant to modern science. Yet the process by which they achieved these insights, through intrusion, control, and detachment, casts a long shadow over their accomplishments. The findings themselves are intertwined with the moral compromises and human costs of the work, a reminder that scientific knowledge is rarely divorced from the context in which it is pursued. By examining the breakthroughs and abnormal findings of Bavarian bloodline science, we are invited into a world of wonder and unease. The observations hint at possibilities that were both exhilarating and dangerous, suggesting a universe of inherited traits, predispositions, and potential yet to be fully understood. At the same time, they serve as a testament to the ethical blind spots, the human cost, and the moral complexity that underpin the experiments. It is a world where knowledge and obsession, curiosity and control, ambition and morality are inseparably intertwined, a world that continues to haunt historians, scientists, and anyone who contemplates the delicate balance between discovery and humanity. For years, the work of the Bavarian bloodline researchers unfolded in relative obscurity, hidden behind the heavy doors of aristocratic manors and carefully controlled laboratories. Families involved in the experiments kept their participation secret, partly out of pride and partly due to the quiet pressure exerted by the researchers. The experiments were framed as a scientific privilege, a rare opportunity to contribute to the understanding of human heredity. Yet the very secrecy that protected the work also made it fragile, and eventually, cracks began to appear. Rumors whispered through local communities, fragments of information leaked, and subtle signs of scandal emerged, threatening to undo the carefully constructed facade of propriety and intellectual ambition. The first stirrings of public awareness were subtle. Neighbors noticed children being measured, photographed, and subjected to strange routines. Domestic staff and tutors, tasked with observing and recording behavior, sometimes whispered about the unusual attention given to certain families. These small murmurs, initially dismissed or ignored, gradually coalesced into speculation. Letters and diaries from the period hint at local curiosity and even concern, though the details are often vague, reflecting the culture of discretion that surrounded aristocratic households. What outsiders could not fully grasp was the meticulous and obsessive nature of the research being conducted behind closed doors. As the experiments continued and the family's involvement became more visible, the pressure of social perception began to mount. In a society deeply conscious of reputation and status, Even subtle deviations from social norms could provoke suspicion or judgment. The carefully orchestrated image of the aristocratic household as a model of refinement and propriety was threatened by the meticulous attention lavished on certain children and the peculiar routines demanded by the researchers. Families found themselves navigating a delicate balance, maintaining appearances, participating in scientific study, and managing the anxieties of children whose lives had become intertwined with observation and measurement. The tension between public perception and private practice created a pressure cooker environment, one in which the risk of scandal was always present. In some instances, more concrete exposure occurred. Letters between scientists, often copied or intercepted, revealed details of methodology, measurements, and family involvement. Researchers corresponded not only with each other but also with distant colleagues, comparing data and discussing anomalies. The meticulous records, though intended to remain confidential, occasionally found their way into broader scholarly networks, sparking debate and curiosity. While these exchanges were rarely public in the modern sense, they nonetheless created the first inklings of scrutiny outside the immediate circle of patrons and researchers. This slow emergence of attention, combined with local curiosity, marked the beginning of a crisis for the secretive projects. Press coverage, when it eventually appeared, was cautious and coded. Newspapers of the time often discussed heredity, intelligence, and the study of human families without naming specific subjects, yet the implications were clear to informed readers. Articles hinted at unusual experiments conducted among the nobility, at families whose children were observed for traits across generations, and at methods that seemed extraordinary or intrusive. The reporting was not sensationalist in the modern sense, but it carried an undercurrent of fascination and concern, drawing attention to the ethical boundaries of contemporary science. Scholars and medical professionals engaged with these accounts, debating the legitimacy, morality, and potential of bloodline studies, while families involved quietly grappled with the growing exposure of what had been intended as a private endeavor. The public discovery and resulting scandal, though limited in scope, created ripples that reached the highest levels of both society and science. Aristocratic patrons, previously enthusiastic or compliant, began to reconsider their involvement. The veneer of privilege and scientific prestige could no longer fully shield families from scrutiny, and the reputational risk became increasingly apparent. Some withdrew their support quietly, removing children from observation or halting the collection of data, while others attempted to control the narrative, issuing reassurances or framing the work as purely academic. The delicate balance of secrecy, compliance, and prestige that had sustained the experiments for decades was suddenly under threat. Within the scientific community, the response was equally complex. Some researchers argued passionately for the value of the work, emphasizing the importance of continuity, meticulous observation, and the potential for groundbreaking discoveries. Others raised ethical objections, questioning whether the manipulation of families, children, and social structures was justifiable, even in pursuit of knowledge. The debate was often private, constrained by the social hierarchies and expectations of the time, but it highlighted the growing tension between ambition and accountability. The work that had been possible under the protective veil of aristocratic support now faced scrutiny, not only from the public but from colleagues who began to confront the ethical ambiguities of their own field. Amidst this tension, some families reacted in ways that reveal the human dimension of the emerging scandal. Diaries indicate that parents experienced fear, guilt, and regret, torn between their desire to support scientific inquiry and their concern for their children's well-being. Children, already accustomed to observation, were exposed to increased attention from outsiders, adding layers of anxiety and confusion to their daily lives. The psychological impact of scrutiny, once confined to the laboratories and manors, now extended into the broader social sphere, further complicating the lives of those involved. The slow unraveling of secrecy demonstrated that even the most carefully controlled experiments could not fully contain human curiosity, societal judgment, and the inevitable consequences of visibility. Ultimately, the public discovery and whisper of scandal accelerated the decline of these experiments. Families withdrew, researchers were forced to justify or abandon certain lines of inquiry, and the very aura of exclusivity that had enabled the work dissipated. What had once seemed like a privileged and private pursuit now appeared morally questionable, socially precarious, and increasingly unsustainable. The delicate ecosystem that allowed bloodline science to flourish, combining secrecy, social hierarchy, and scientific ambition, was destabilized, revealing the fragility of work that relied on both consent and ignorance. The exposure also left a mark on the historical record, though in a paradoxical way. Because the scandal was never fully publicized, the details of the experiments, the families involved, and the findings themselves were gradually obscured, leaving tantalizing fragments for historians and scientists to piece together. The combination of secrecy, partial exposure, and deliberate erasure created a narrative both compelling and haunting, a story that whispers of ambition, curiosity, and human cost while refusing to fully disclose the scope of the work. The scandal, though limited in its immediate consequences, became a crucial turning point, signaling that even extraordinary privilege and secrecy could not fully insulate the experiments from social, ethical, and moral scrutiny. Through this lens, the story of public discovery and scandal becomes more than a historical footnote. It is a window into the fragile intersection of secrecy, science, and society. It demonstrates how the pursuit of knowledge, when conducted in isolation from ethical oversight and public accountability, inevitably collides with broader human realities. Families, researchers, and communities were caught in this collision, revealing both the allure and the danger of ambition and tempered by conscience. It is a chapter that resonates with enduring relevance, reminding us that the pursuit of discovery, no matter how meticulous or well-intentioned, exists within a complex web of human relationships, ethical boundaries, and societal expectations. As the years passed and the whispers of scandal grew, the once carefully orchestrated experiments on Bavarian bloodlines began to unravel quietly, almost imperceptibly. What had been conducted with meticulous precision, backed by aristocratic patronage and cloaked in secrecy, was gradually abandoned, not through dramatic exposure or public condemnation, but through a series of subtle pressures, ethical hesitations, and practical obstacles that combined to make the continuation of the work increasingly untenable. The very secrecy that had initially protected the research now contributed to its erosion. As families became wary, social scrutiny intensified, and the researchers themselves began to confront the limits of both ambition and conscience. Families, who had once participated willingly or out of social expectation, began to withdraw. Some moved their children away from observation, citing personal reasons or shifts in household circumstances. Others refused to continue the meticulous record-keeping that had been central to the experiments, claiming fatigue or loss of interest. The pressure to maintain appearances, which had once ensured compliance, now worked in the opposite direction. The slightest deviation from routine could no longer be entirely concealed, and the potential for misunderstanding or social censure increased. Aristocratic patrons, long invested in the notion of preserving the purity of their lineage, became cautious, weighing the prestige of participation against the growing social and ethical ambiguities that had begun to surface. Within the laboratories, researchers faced their own constraints. The meticulous methodologies that had characterized the experiments demanded constant attention, resources, and energy. Maintaining long-term observation over multiple generations was logistically challenging, and even the most dedicated scientists found it increasingly difficult to reconcile ambition with the practical limitations of time, manpower, and societal support. Letters and diaries from the era hint at frustration and resignation, as researchers lamented the interruption of carefully planned studies or the loss of access to families that had previously been cooperative. The combination of ethical tension, social scrutiny, and practical difficulty created a perfect storm that gradually brought the experiments to a halt. Ethical considerations, once largely compartmentalized or rationalized, began to weigh more heavily on the minds of the scientists. The constant observation of children, the manipulation of family relationships, and the cataloging of personal traits without consent were no longer abstract concepts to be justified solely in the name of discovery. Researchers began to acknowledge, if only in private notes, that the human cost of the experiments was significant. Children grew up under scrutiny, their psychological and emotional development shaped by the invasive attention of adults who viewed them primarily as subjects of study. Parents experienced conflicting emotions, torn between curiosity, pride, and concern for their children's well-being. These moral dilemmas, long suppressed, gradually contributed to the decision to cease or scale back the work. The broader scientific and social climate also played a role. As the limitations and uncertainties of the research became more apparent, the excitement and prestige that had initially supported bloodline studies began to fade. Other areas of science were attracting attention, and the novelty of hereditary research, while still intriguing, could no longer justify the risks and complications inherent in its continuation. Moreover, the subtle exposure of the work, through rumors, limited press coverage, and correspondence that occasionally fell into the wrong hands, served as a reminder that the experiments were not entirely insulated from societal judgment. The combination of diminishing novelty, increased scrutiny, and ethical tension created an environment in which quiet abandonment became the most prudent course of action. The The process of cessation was deliberate yet discreet. Researchers did not publicly denounce their own work, nor did families issue statements of withdrawal. Instead, data collection gradually slowed, observations became less frequent, and new subjects were rarely enrolled. Laboratories were cleared, notes were archived or hidden, and correspondence tapered off. The quiet nature of this abandonment ensured that the experiments left little trace for contemporaries, contributing to the later perception that these studies had never existed or were insignificant. Yet the disappearance was not total. Fragments of notebooks, letters, and photographs survived, hinting at a meticulous and morally complex pursuit that had once held great promise and deep peril. What is perhaps most striking about this quiet abandonment is the sense of lost knowledge. The researchers had glimpsed patterns, correlations, and anomalies that might have informed future studies in heredity and genetics. Some of their observations, had they been continued or further developed, could have contributed to the understanding of inherited traits in ways that were only recognized decades later. Yet the ethical, social, and practical constraints of the time made continuation impossible. In abandoning the work, the scientists acknowledged, even if indirectly, that the pursuit of knowledge was inseparable from the responsibility to protect human dignity, and that some experiments, however fascinating, exacted too high a price to justify continuation. The story of Bavaria's bloodline research thus ends not with scandal, revelation, or dramatic collapse, but with quiet disappearance. Laboratories fell silent, families returned to lives unobserved, and the meticulous records, though partially preserved, were largely forgotten. It is a haunting conclusion, one that speaks to the fragility of ambition when it collides with human complexity, social norms, and ethical awareness. The quiet abandonment underscores the tension between discovery and responsibility, curiosity and consequence, and leaves the modern observer with a lingering sense of both fascination and unease. Even today, the legacy of this period is felt in fragments. Historians and scientists examining the surviving records are confronted with the meticulous rigor of the observations, the ambition of the researchers, and the profound moral ambiguity that accompanied every measurement and note. The abandoned experiments serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us that scientific pursuit, however noble in intent, cannot exist in a vacuum, and that the boundaries between insight and intrusion, curiosity and cruelty, are often more delicate than those who wield knowledge may realize.